and welcome to the Debrief. I'm Donna King, Carolina Journal's editor-in-chief. Joining us this week, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation and David Larson, managing editor of CJ. We're going to be talking about a few things. First, Nick Craig is going to be joining us in just a little bit from Wilmington to talk about the end of hurricane season. But we're really also talking about the budget impasse that we've seen in Raleigh. It looks like that come December, there are no currently votes scheduled, but Speaker Hall has put out an op-ed talking about why they have not been able to come to an agreement on the state budget, and plus the latest developments in two pieces of litigation, one on redistricting, one on energy and Duke Energy. So we're going to be talking about all of those today. But first, let's jump in. We're going to be talking about the budget. So a sharp escalation in what's been happening with a new op-ed out from Speaker of the North Carolina House of Representatives, Destin Hall, arguing that the reason that the legislature has not put forward a plan for our new budget is that they can't really close that remaining budget gap due to triggers in our tax code, plan triggers. Let's talk about where that stands now. Mitch, would you jump in and tell us what are some of the core differences between the House and Senate's position on the budget?
Sure. Remember that both the State House and the State Senate came up with their own budget plans, but they couldn't come to an agreement on a final deal. So that's what we've been dealing with. This has gone on. The budget year started July 1st. As the process started, we expected there would be some sort of agreement, if not by July 1st, shortly afterward, but it really became very apparent that that was not going to happen. And because of a state law that was passed in 2016 that says if you don't have a new state budget by the time the budget year starts, the old budget remains in effect, that's what we've had. So old spending levels have remained in effect with the proviso that there have been some mini budgets that have hit some of the issues where they have had agreement. But most of what would be in a comprehensive 2-year budget that they would approve in an odd number year has not been done. And there are multiple sticking points, but the really big thing is what to do about taxes and tax rates. Because the tax rates that you have will determine the amount of money that's coming in. The individual income tax rate dropped again this year, as was spelled out in a previous budget year. It drops again next year. Drops from 4.25% to just under 4%. Everyone agrees on that. The disagreement is about what to do next. The state Senate's plan said, let's guarantee 2 additional decreases in the tax rate after the one that's already going to come in 2026, and then through some revenue triggers, potentially lower the tax rate to as low as under 2%. Meanwhile, the State House said, we're okay with what's already in the plan to go down to 3.99%. But after that, it looks like our budget situation is not good enough that we should have additional tax cuts just guaranteed. They wanted to raise some revenue triggers that were already in the previous budget plans higher, and what they're saying, it's based on inflation. We've had such large inflation that the revenue triggers really weren't a good assessment of where things need to be. Let's raise those based on what we've seen from inflation. So if we do have good amount of revenue coming in, we could still have tax cuts. But if the revenue isn't as high as we had projected a couple of years ago, we'll stick with that 3.99% and just make sure we have enough money to deal with the state's needs. Now, that's the big item, but then there's some other things that are in there that go along with that, and that is some priorities on spending. The House is more interested in spending more for employee and teacher pay raises than the Senate has been. The Senate is very interested in having this new children's hospital, this Duke UNC Children's Hospital, and throwing hundreds of millions of dollars into that, whereas the House, which agreed to some money for that a while ago, is not totally on board with fully funding this thing. And then there are some other things too. The Senate wants to get rid of the certificate of need, healthcare restrictions. House has shown no interest in that. So there are main sticking points, but I think if they could come to an agreement on what to do about taxes, and thus, based on that, what the revenue picture would be, then they could probably settle the rest of the stuff fairly quickly.
But spending, I mean, if they just spent less, wouldn't we already have a deal?
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know that would have a deal, but it would make it easier for a deal because, and that's one thing that the John Locke Foundation has recommended is if you would take your projected amount of spending, because they agreed on a spending level.
Sure.
And they said, and the Locke Foundation's research says, well, if you just lower that, that would make things a whole lot easier, because then you could come to an agreement on what to do about taxes. You'd have more leeway on where the tax rates could be. But based on the spending level that the House and Senate had agreed to, then it makes it harder for them to come to an agreement on what to do about the tax level side.
Sure.
Because they are spending much more than they need to be spending based on the old Tabor requirement of just limiting your growth to inflation plus population growth.
Right, right. Well, and that's the actual question. When we talk about revenue projections, this is something that Locke Foundation has also said that they're notoriously wrong, that these revenue projections, but Hall is saying they'd have to be wronger than they've ever been wrong for this to work. Tell me a little bit about the revenue projections process.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems to me like it's almost like a fight between two different conservative principles.
Sure.
One is, yeah, we should keep lowering taxes. Like that's always a good thing to do for conservatives. And the other is, Hall saying, is this going to be enough revenue? Are these projections going to be so wrong, or are they going to work out in our favor? And I think he's right that a lot of new people are moving to the state, and also I think Joseph Harris, our fiscal analyst, pointed out like 46% of revenue into our state budgets are also coming from federal government. So there's also a worry there that if a lot of that goes away, then our state budgets could be in trouble. So it's not a bad instinct to think, how are we going to pay for all the things we do, and do we have enough revenue coming in? Sometimes, as Brian Balfour said in a recent op-ed on this, the tax cuts actually bring in more revenue because the economy gets stirred by them, so it's not necessarily the case. That's why they're wrong sometimes, is that's not baked into the estimations, the revenue forecast as much as it could be. So it's a fight there, I guess, on do we really need more revenue? If we lower these tax rates, is there another form? I know a lot of free market people like other forms of taxation, sales tax, that kind of thing, maybe to make up for it, but we would need to have some ways of paying for these things.
Sure.
I think maybe a bigger issue is also we're headed into election year. I don't know if it's a bigger issue, but it's another thing on a lot of people's mind is there's headwinds already for Republicans.
Sure.
Does this look like chaos? Does it look like they're not really accomplishing their main goals here that they came to Raleigh? In this year they're supposed to have the budget together. They weren't able to do that. Is that going to look bad to voters going into 2026 when when you have the White House has somebody in your party in it? It's also often a little bit of a headwind there. In the 2025 odd year elections didn't look great.
Statistically, yeah.
Is this something that will, in North Carolina, just create another kind of bad perception that could come back to hurt them?
Sure. Well, I mean, we're also Republicans are a decade in to having control. They've had control of the General Assembly for a decade, and we've seen tremendous strides in economic development, lower taxes, a lot of policy. This is getting into the fine tuning. It seems like. Isn't this what triggers are for? I mean, you don't lower taxes until you get the revenue that you can support it.
Right. That was actually one of the great innovations when the General Assembly first decided to do this. They said, we want to lower taxes, but we also want to make sure we have enough revenue to cover the state's expenses. So we'll put in these revenue triggers. As long as we get this amount of revenue, then we can lower the tax rates again. And one of the bones of contention this time around is that the revenue triggers that were put in the last budget, the Senate was fine with that. The House, from the Senate's perspective, is going back on that, saying, well, the Senate's saying, well, wait a minute, you agreed to this a couple years ago. Why aren't these revenue triggers that we had before, why aren't they valid anymore?
Right.
And in fact, remember when the House first came out with its budget, there were some on the Senate side and among their allies who were saying the House wants to raise taxes because they wanted to raise those revenue triggers, which obviously didn't help when the Senate is accusing the House of wanting to raise taxes. We are a number of years away from this, but there are some people who are still involved in this process who remember that before North Carolina went on its big tax cutting endeavor. Kansas was a state that cut taxes substantially, but then also didn't do anything about the spending side, and so got into a huge budget hole and set back the idea of cutting taxes substantially.
Right,
because
they have to go together.
Yeah, I mean, you have to do something about the spending if you're going to cut the tax rates. And so I think there are some who are in this debate who are saying, let's not get out over our skis. We've got these tax cuts that are coming. No one disagrees about the tax cut that took effect for this year and the one that's going to take effect for 2026. But after that, wouldn't it make sense, given that we've had the inflation, given that these projections are showing even larger deficits than they did in the past, wouldn't it make sense to kind of hold the line for a while, and then look at it if the revenue numbers come in? Whereas the Senate side is saying basically what David was talking about earlier. You've been saying that we were going to have a shortfall every time for the last decade and a half, and it's never come to fruition. Why should we believe it now?
Sure. So where we stand today is they're scheduled to have a session on December 15th, but it looks like there's going to be no votes. This may be a housekeeping kind of session.
Might not even be housekeeping. It may just be a skeletal session where a handful of people show up, they gavel in, gavel out. That is something they set up, and it's not the first time, but they did this when they adjourned basically kind of for the year back in the summer, is they said they'd come back for a few days every month. And if they don't have to, they won't. And we may not see them come back for real until into the spring. I mean, it just depends on what they decide that they can come to agreement on.
So what happens with the budget process?
Well, I mean, there really isn't a budget process beyond the two sides, when they decide to do it, coming together and having negotiations.
Right.
I mean, the budget process, since the two sides have come up with their own plans, is basically just negotiating when they want to.
Okay.
And right now, it seems like they're not interested in doing it.
They're not wanting to. So let's go on to some of these lawsuits that we've seen. This is, I guess, a procedural win, really, for lawmakers, that a federal judge says that the GA can intervene in a lawsuit about the Watauga County voting districts. We had a story up on Carolina Journal about that. Tell me about this, and what are the core argument in this lawsuit against these Watauga districts?
Okay, so this is one of the separate redistricting cases. We know we had the big redistricting fight, and the big news recently on that was that the North Carolina new congressional map, unless there's some sort of appeal that we don't know about yet, is going to be used for 2026. So that was the big redistricting news. But there is this other suit, a group called the Watauga Voting Rights Task Force, I think is its name, doesn't like the fact that the General Assembly came in and, regardless of what the people in Watauga County think, decided to redraw election maps for county commissioner and school board races. They did it in two separate bills, and so this Watauga Voting Rights Task Force sued, blocking this. One of the pieces of evidence they have is, hey, we put a referendum on the ballot, which was to have these new districts set up by our own county commissioners. People supported that by 71%. They didn't want your district's General Assembly, and so that they have sued. But when they originally sued, they sued the Watauga Board of Elections. They didn't sue the General Assembly, and the General Assembly stepped in and said, wait a minute, we're the ones who drew these districts. We're the ones who should defend it, so they asked to intervene. No one really said that they shouldn't, and so they have been allowed to intervene. The real key on that case at this point is, will a judge enjoin those districts? So for the next election, will we have the districts that were made by the General Assembly, or will we have the districts that were made by the locals themselves? And that's really still up in the air at this point.
Right. Now, bring us up to date on the redistricting case, the big one.
So the big one is there was the new congressional map, of course. That was drawn. The only changes are switching some counties between District 1 and District 3 in the eastern part of the state, so that District 1 becomes more Republican, District 3 becomes less Republican, but they're still both Republican, and the idea was to help Republicans pick up District 1. A 3-judge federal panel decided that they were not going to grant an injunction, so the map could go forward. The only thing that would change that is if the plaintiffs appeal and either the Fourth Circuit or the Supreme Court decides to grant an injunction. At this point, since candidate filing has already started, my guess is that doesn't happen.
Right, sounds like it. Now, also, we had candidate filing started this week on Monday, right at noon, and we saw, you can see it on CarolinaJournal.com, big crowd actually out there throwing their name in the hat. It really is interesting to watch this process. This really is an example of, self-government, because we can talk about the numbers and the districts and redistricting and the CPI, the Civitas Partisan Index, but at the end, it's individuals willing to go out, jump in the race, and put their name, their money on into these campaigns. Tell me what was your takeaway from this? Because we saw, Richard Hudson was there first thing, Bobby Hanig and CD1.
In a kind of subdued coat for him. I
Right,
think it was
bright
bright
red.
red, and it was like lower on his
Right, he's known
wild
for his
scale.
outfits. We'll drop a few pictures in here. But yeah, Bobby Hanig known for his outfits. Anita Earls, Associate Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, all out there, signing up to run again. And it's interesting to see those who are well known going out on the first day and those who perhaps are not as well known. What were your impressions of this process?
Yeah, it's definitely part of the civic life of our country, and we, part of our tradition. Just like going out to vote is kind of a tradition for a lot of people. That process of somebody deciding, I'm going to put my name out there, and going and on that day. We have a little bit of, a couple weeks. I think they can go out there and do
19th,
that. But
the 19th.
The 19th.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, I think it takes a lot of bravery, just because, especially now in the age of social media.
Sure.
I mean, people really quickly can go through. Oh, you said this on YouTube, 20 years ago,
Right.
and whatever. Like, you have all these things, paper trails. People can get on you, or they can just make up things. Now, not to say that this wasn't the case, when there was newspapers. You have.
Sure.
Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, there's famous
Edenton
things
Tea Party
that
got
they
blasted
said
in London, yeah.
that they'd say about each other, but it was more limited on the reach of those things compared to the tools we have now. So it does take a lot of bravery, and it's not always a fun thing. They really are sacrificing, because for candidates, I think about half of their time that they're campaigning is probably just being on the phone raising money, which is not it's not fun to cold call somebody and say, yeah, I met you one time at this dinner. Can I have $500?
Right.
It's just not a fun thing to
It
do.
is.
So they're putting themselves out there. They're putting their families. Their sacrifice. If they're married with kids, then their spouse might have to. It puts strain on all of that. So yeah, it's definitely part of our civic tradition.
Yeah. One of the things I'd like to see everybody do is really get out there, go to a town hall meeting, get to know some of these people and what they stand for, because even the ones that are very, very close, the small races, the ones that most directly impact your community, those are critical.
They are, and we should note neither one of them showed up on day one, but both of the major contenders in the big race, the 2026 U.S. Senate race, have now filed. Former Democratic Governor Roy Cooper and former State and Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Whatley, both of them officially now
have
in the
now
race.
filed, and in that Republican primary, Don Brown, and there's someone from Smithfield that was a new name to me, but it is interesting to see how this is going to be a very expensive Senate race, right?
Oh yeah. It looks like a few people, including former CJ staffer. Alex Balsagar says it could be the most expensive in history.
Sure.
There've been some others, Ohio, and others that have been very expensive, but maybe 500 million.
Right.
Some even said as high as $1 billion. I don't know about that,
I don't know
but
about that.
but yeah,
seven,
with inflation, maybe
with inflation. But yeah, I mean, it's there's only a couple places Democrats can really go. One is they want to take out the main Republican U.S. Senator was Susan Collins, who she's always vulnerable, but somehow she sneaks through because she's sort of liberal on a few things. And maybe their other best bet for Democrats trying to take back the U.S. Senate is, flipping this seat from Tillis to Cooper, as Tillis steps aside. Because other than that, they've got Iowa, Ohio, Florida, and Texas are their next 4 best bets. Those aren't nearly as attractive, so they're going to dump money into this. And Republicans obviously are going to fight them on it. So
it is going to be a long year for sure. So what else did you want to talk about? We wanted to talk a little bit about the Duke Energy here.
Yeah, just very briefly. There is a long-standing court fight between Duke Energy and a competitor based in Florida called NTE, and the official name is NTE Carolinas. But the company's based in Florida, and it all revolves around the energy business for the city of Fayetteville. So the city of Fayetteville as a customer, not the people in Fayetteville, but the actual government of the city of Fayetteville. when their contract last came up with Duke, this group, NTE Carolinas, wanted to compete for the contract. And NTE filed suit against Duke saying that Duke was involved in anti-competitive behavior trying to block the competition for this contract. Well, a trial judge ruled in favor of Duke, but the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals said, no, there's enough that this case should go forward. And so the Fourth Circuit would allow the lawsuit to go forward. Duke appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court, rather than saying initially whether it was going to take the case or not, asked the U.S. Solicitor General's office, so this is the lawyer that argues on behalf of the federal government at the Supreme Court, they asked the Solicitor General's office to weigh in on this. And that was 6 months ago. This week, the Solicitor General filed a brief in this case and said, yeah, it looks like Duke's acting like a monopolist. They're doing everything a monopolist would do.
Right.
There's no reason why the Supreme Court should take this case. Just let it go forward and go to the trial level. The Supreme Court could decide fairly soon whether they're going to take this case or not. But that was a major significant development that the U.S. Solicitor General stepped in and said, looks like, based on what we see in the record, that what Duke is up to is anti-competitive behavior and that this lawsuit should go forward.
Thanks. All right, well, let's bring in Nick Craig. He's talking a little bit about the hurricane season. Officially wraps this month, and it was an interesting one. No major hurricanes came ashore. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, Donna, and I guess after what we saw in 2024 with the unimaginable amount of destruction and devastation left in the wake of western North Carolina after Hurricane Helene, I'm sure most folks across the state a little bit of a sigh of relief as this hurricane season ended. This is the first time in a decade that a landfalling hurricane did not make an impact on the continental United States. 13 named storms in total, 5 of them reached hurricane strength, 4 majors. But fortunately here for the continental United States, North and South Carolina, no major impacts. However, there were a couple of tropical storms that caused some problems. Back over the July 4th weekend of this year, 2025, Tropical Storm Chantal left a significant amount of destruction in its wake in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. We saw, unfortunately, a couple deaths from that storm, dozens of water rescues taking place, a couple of rivers cresting at higher levels than storms going back 30 or 40 years. And so one of the things that you'll consistently hear from the National Weather Service or the National Hurricane Center is obviously, yes, hurricanes are stronger than tropical storms, but just because something isn't deemed a hurricane, it can still have major impacts, as we saw this year with Tropical Storm Chantal.
Of course. Yeah, you've been talking a little bit in your article on CarolinaJournal.com about new AI tools that could help us better predict damage. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, this is the first year that NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, used AI as part of their forecast modeling. Now, I do want to stress and make sure we let our audience know this was not a full AI forecast. They were not trusting the AI gods to make full-on predictions as it relates to hurricane tracking and watching these storms. But we did see the use of AI. Google actually spearheaded this hurricane season with an exclusively AI-only model that was kind of interesting to watch as we were tracking some of these storms throughout the summer months to see how that kind of operated and acted in comparison to the traditional weather models that we look at, the major GFS, the U.S. model, the European model as well. So it was an interesting year to see AI in use, and it's something that, whether you want to like it or not, is going to continue to be a major part of literally every single aspect of our lives, even in this case, the National Hurricane Center and their predictions from the Atlantic Basin.
Sure. Are these telling us that 2025 might be an anomaly for not having that much activity?
Well, that's the thing is, even though there was no landfalling hurricanes, again, a couple of tropical storms, but no landfalling hurricanes, this was very much on par with an average season, which NOAA did predict as the season started on June the 1st of this year, ran through the end of November. They were predicting about this, and an average NOAA Atlantic Basin hurricane season, we see about 14 named storms. So we were right below that at 13. See a handful of hurricanes, a couple of majors. So even though we didn't see any immediate impacts here across the United States, this was an on-par season. We just got lucky with some low-pressure systems blocking those storms and forcing them off the coast of North Carolina.
Very interesting. All right. Thanks so much, Nick. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, so tell me what you think about this. We were talking a little bit about how we manage the post-storm destruction. Maybe we have a little bit of a breather this year. We didn't really get hit hard, but Helene, of course, was a big one back in September. What are your thoughts on this process?
Yeah, before Helene, there was the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience and NCORE, and that had been created by Governor Roy Cooper in 2018, I believe, to look after especially hurricane damage from Matthew and Florence.
Yeah.
And after 6 years, they'd still built no homes where had been completed, and I think now they kind of ramped it up, and they have completed, I think, around 3,000 or 4,000. But when Stein came into office, he said, we're going to kind of step away from that for Hurricane Helene relief. We're going to go create this Governor's Recovery Office of Western North Carolina. Grow and See. Grow and See, which it may be a little risky to put his name. It's the governor's office, because if it doesn't go well, maybe
that's what happened to NCORE and Cooper. Yeah.
True. So they're going to do it that way, but I guess kind of what I've been thinking about is this is the way you go about it for this with storm recovery. It seems very different than other areas where there's, over time, a lot of these government managed programs turn into, they're more efficient if they're run as voucher programs or cash transfer programs. Like with housing, they used to do more public housing buildings and apartments and all of this, and they gradually found it's more efficient to do housing vouchers. Or with food stamps, before they had the EBT cards, the government used to go and collect food from farms, excess food, and deliver it in the 1930s.
Like a government-run soup kitchen or
and they would deliver government bread and cheese and all this.
Right.
And they found it to be very inefficient to do that. So I don't know why this, just looking at the numbers, where they took in, they spent $1.3 billion, NCORE did, and it was $320 million over what they were supposed to have spent.
Right.
And they only at that point made about 3,000 homes. So it's about like $430,000 per, and it's not even building homes. A lot of these are just repairs. So it could be a trailer or a house that needs $10,000, $20,000 worth of work. But they created 200 something jobs that were in this office, and they weren't really building. They're trying to find local contractors to do it.
Right.
My thought is just do kind of like these other voucherized and cash transfer programs, where send somebody out to inspect it. Okay, there was this amount of damage. Can we verify this person's identity, that they own this home?
Right.
Okay, cut them a check for 30 grand.
That's what I thought it actually did. I mean, that seems so much more efficient. Do you think there's an appetite for changing it to more of a voucher type system?
Yeah, we think there would be.
Yeah.
I mean, the bureaucracy always takes its cut. So to the extent that you cannot have a bureaucracy or limit it and have it just be more, if you think that people need to have some funding to meet their needs, then just give them the funding rather than setting up a new government entity that will take the money, take its own cut for overhead and administration, and as David said, hiring 200 people and stick them in an office, spending all the money for the office. Just don't do that. Just give the people the money.
Yeah.
And they actually find the contractors and manage each step of the contractor's process. And they have
They have to be there for the inspection.
Environmental review for each of
crazy.
these things takes forever. Yeah, it's just a long process, and you can trust people, I think, if they to just take, okay, there's $20,000 worth of damage, here's a check for, and then just maybe they spend it on something else. But
much
is that
more efficient? Much more efficient.
So that's who knows how it'll go, but I have my doubts. Grow and See will be much different if it's
More
operating
efficient.
on the same principles as NCORE.
Interesting. All right, we'll be watching that closely. Make sure you check out carolinajournal.com and johnlocke.org for latest on all of this. And comment below. We want to hear from you. Keep that conversation going. Make sure you subscribe so you just don't miss a thing. Thanks so much.